The great hall of the council stretched before Ambassador Lyra like a crystalline cathedral, its walls pulsing with the soft blue light that her people found comforting. Today, however, the familiar glow did nothing to ease the tension coiling in her chest. She stood at the center of the circular chamber, surrounded by the 12 high counselors whose elongated forms towered above her even while seated. Their silver skin shimmered with stress patterns that any could read like an open book. "The humans refuse our latest proposal," announced Counselor, his voice carrying the harmonic undertones that made every statement sound like a song. "Their expansion into the Helix sector continues unabated. 3 more of our mining colonies have been displaced this cycle." Lyra's own skin rippled with patterns of determination mixed with frustration. She had spent the better part of 2 standard years trying to negotiate with the human delegation, but their representatives seemed incapable of understanding the concept of shared space. Where her people saw the galaxy as a vast garden to be cultivated together, humans appeared to view it as territory to be conquered and divided. "Perhaps we need a different approach," Lyra said, her voice steady despite the gravity of what she was about to propose. "The humans value personal bonds above political abstractions. Their history shows they are more likely to honor agreements when they involve individual relationships rather than institutional treaties." Counselor leaned forward, her ancient features creased with concern. "What are you suggesting, young ambassador?" Lyra's skin patterns shifted to display resolve. "I propose a marriage alliance, one of our own joined in bond with a human representative. It would create a personal stake in maintaining peace between our species." The chamber fell silent except for the soft humming of the bioluminescent walls. Several counselors exchanged glances, their skin patterns flickering with surprise and consideration. The concept wasn't entirely foreign to culture, though it had been centuries since such a diplomatic union had been necessary. "The risks are considerable," Counselor Thane observed. "Human emotional patterns are chaotic and unpredictable. Their bonding rituals are alien to our ways, and there is but a fraction of ours." "All true," Lyra acknowledged. "But consider the alternative. Our intelligence reports suggest the humans are developing new jump drive technology that could give them access to our core systems within a decade. If we cannot find a path to coexistence, we may face a choice between surrender and total war." The weight of that statement settled over the council like a heavy shroud. They were an ancient race, their civilization spanning, but they were not warriors by nature. Their technology focused on harmony and sustainability rather than destruction. The humans, despite being relative newcomers to the galactic stage, had already proven themselves formidable in both innovation and aggression. "Who would undertake such a mission?" Counselor asked finally. Lyra's patterns shifted again, this time displaying the deep purple of personal commitment. "I volunteer myself. I have studied human culture more extensively than any other member of our diplomatic corps. I understand their language, their customs, and their psychological frameworks. If anyone can make such an alliance work, it would be me." The counselors deliberated for hours, their discussion ranging across political implications, cultural considerations, and personal risks. Lyra remained standing throughout, her resolve never wavering even as they dissected every possible outcome. When they finally reached their decision, Counselor spoke for the group. "The Council approves your proposal, Ambassador Lyra. However, we must choose the human candidate carefully. Our intelligence network will identify potential partners who hold sufficient influence within human society and demonstrate the psychological stability necessary for such an undertaking." Over the following weeks, Lyra threw herself into preparation. She studied every aspect of human courtship and marriage customs, from the exchange of rings to the concept of romantic love that seemed so central to their bonding process. The more she learned, the more she realized how different this would be from pair bonding, which was based primarily on complementary life paths and mutual respect. The intelligence reports eventually identified 3 potential candidates. The first was a military officer whose aggressive tendencies immediately disqualified him in Lyra's mind. The second was a politician whose public statements suggested he viewed aliens as inferior beings. The third, however, caught her attention immediately. Doctor was who had spent his career advocating for peaceful contact with alien species. His research papers showed a deep respect for non-human intelligence and a genuine curiosity about other forms of life. He was also unmarried, having apparently dedicated most of his adult life to his scientific work. Most importantly, he served as an advisor to the Human Colonial Council, giving him significant influence over policy decisions. The approach had to be subtle. Lyra arranged to attend a scientific conference on Station, a neutral territory where humans and various alien species gathered to share research. She presented a paper on bioadaptation techniques, ensuring that Doctor would be in the audience. The presentation went well, and during the reception that followed, she found herself in conversation with the human scientist. Was shorter than most humans Lyra had encountered, with dark hair and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to take in every detail of her appearance without making her feel like a specimen under examination. His questions about her research were thoughtful and demonstrated a genuine understanding of the complexities involved in biological adaptation across different planetary environments. "Your people's approach to terraforming is fascinating," he said, sipping from a glass of what appeared to be fermented fruit juice. "Instead of reshaping worlds to suit your biology, you adapt your biology to suit the worlds. It's elegant and sustainable." "We believe in harmony rather than dominion," Lyra replied, noting how his facial expressions changed subtly as he processed her words. Human faces were remarkably expressive, she had learned, conveying far more emotional information than most species realized. "I wish more humans thought that way," said with what Lyra recognized as a rueful smile. "Too often we see a planet and immediately start planning how to change it rather than how to live with it." They talked for several hours, their conversation ranging across topics from astrobiology to philosophy. Lyra found herself genuinely enjoying the interaction, which had not been part of her original calculations, possessed a quick wit and a perspective that challenged some of her assumptions about human nature. When the evening ended, they had exchanged contact information and agreed to continue their discussions. Over the following months, Lyra cultivated their relationship carefully. She shared insights about culture while learning more about its background and beliefs. He had grown up on a frontier colony world where humans and several other species lived in relative harmony. This experience had shaped his worldview in ways that made him unusually open-minded compared to other humans from the core worlds. For his part, seemed genuinely fascinated by Lyra and her people. He asked thoughtful questions about society and expressed concern about the growing tensions between their species. When Lyra finally broached the subject of a formal alliance through marriage, she was surprised by his reaction. "I've been wondering if something like this might be necessary," he said during one of their video calls. "The politicians on both sides seem determined to see this as a zero-sum game. Maybe a personal connection could change the dynamic." "You would be willing to consider such an arrangement?" Lyra asked, her skin patterns shifting to display hope mixed with uncertainty. Was quiet for a long moment, his face displaying the internal conflict that humans seem to experience so intensely. "I'll be honest with you, Lyra. The idea terrifies me. Marriage is supposed to be about love, and while I care about you deeply, I'm not sure what we have qualifies as love in the human sense. But I also know that if we don't find a way to make peace between our species, a lot of people are going to die. The concept of pair bonding is different from human romantic love," Lyra explained. "It is based on mutual respect, shared goals, and complementary strengths. Perhaps what we have could grow into something that satisfies both our cultural expectations." The formal proposal came through diplomatic channels 6 months later. Accepted, though Lyra could see the weight of the decision in his communications. They were both gambling their personal happiness on the hope that their union might prevent a war that seemed increasingly inevitable. The wedding ceremony was a carefully crafted blend of human and traditions. It took place on Harmony Station, a joint research facility that had become a symbol of successful cooperation between the two species. Representatives from both governments attended, along with media from across human space. The ceremony was broadcast through their neural networks, allowing billions of citizens to witness the historic moment. Lyra wore traditional ceremonial patterns that painted her skin in swirling designs of silver and blue, while dressed in formal human attire adapted to accommodate the symbolic elements of both cultures. When they exchanged vows, they spoke in both languages, promising to serve not only each other but the cause of peace between their peoples. As they sealed their bond with the ritual exchange of biosignatures that used in place of rings, Lyra felt a complex mixture of hope and apprehension. She had studied carefully and believed him to be a good man, but humans were capable of surprising changes under stress. The weight of two civilizations' futures now rested partially on their ability to make their unlikely marriage work. The early months of their marriage exceeded Lyra's expectations, proved to be a considerate partner who made genuine efforts to understand and accommodate customs. He learned to read her skin patterns and even began to develop some control over his own emotional displays to avoid overwhelming her sensitive, empathic abilities. They established a comfortable domestic routine split between his research facility on Earth and her diplomatic quarters on the neutral station. More importantly, their union began to have the desired political effect. Negotiations between the two species took on a more collegial tone, with both sides making an effort to find common ground rather than simply defending their positions. Several joint research projects were initiated, and the aggressive expansion that had characterized human space policy began to slow. Lyra allowed herself to hope that their gamble might actually succeed. She was beginning to understand what humans meant by love, recognizing the growing affection she felt for as something deeper than mere political alliance. When he surprised her with a gift of rare crystals from his home world, arranged in patterns that mimicked traditional art forms, she realized that he was changing too. Perhaps that should have been her first warning of what was to come. The first sign of trouble came during what should have been a routine diplomatic dinner. Lyra and were hosting a delegation of trade representatives aboard Harmony Station, discussing the expansion of trilateral commerce agreements that would benefit all three species. They were natural mediators, their philosophical approach to conflict resolution having prevented several minor wars over the past century. Ambassador, the lead negotiator, was explaining their proposal for shared shipping lanes when the station's communication array crackled to life with an emergency transmission. The holographic display materialized above the dining table, showing the concerned face of Admiral Harrison, the commanding officer of the human fleet stationed in the nearby Arcturus system. "Dr. Mrs.," the Admiral said, using the human nomming convention that Lyra had adopted for diplomatic purposes. "I'm sorry to interrupt your dinner, but we have a situation that requires immediate attention. A research vessel has strayed into restricted space near our military installation on 7. Lyra's skin patterns immediately shifted to display confusion and concern. "That's impossible, Admiral. All vessels are equipped with updated navigation charts that clearly mark human military zones. Our pilots would never enter such areas without explicit permission." "I'm afraid the evidence suggests otherwise," Admiral Harrison replied, his tone carrying the clipped efficiency that Lyra had learned to associate with human military communications. "The vessel ignored multiple hails and continued on course toward our defense platforms. We had to deploy warning shots to force them to halt." Frowned, setting down his fork. What was the name of the vessel, and what were they doing in that sector? "The ship identifies as the Serenity of Thought, registered as a scientific survey vessel. Their stated mission was to collect samples from the asteroid belt, but they deviated significantly from their filed flight plan." Lyra's patterns shifted to deep purple, the expression of intense concern. "Admiral, I need to speak with the ship's commander immediately. There must be some misunderstanding." "I'm afraid that won't be possible," Admiral Harrison said, and something in his voice made Lyra's empathic senses recoil. "The vessel was destroyed when it attempted to ram our defense station. All hands were lost." The words hit Lyra like a physical blow. She staggered back from the table, her skin cycling through patterns of shock, disbelief, and growing horror. The delegates exchanged worried glances, their own communication tentacles writhing with agitation. Immediately moved to support his wife, his face pale with shock. "That's impossible," Lyra whispered. "No would ever attempt such an attack. We are not a violent species. There must be some mistake." Admiral Harrison's expression softened slightly. "Mrs., I understand this is difficult to accept. Our tactical analysis suggests the ship's navigation systems may have been compromised by some kind of malfunction. The crew might not have been in control when the collision occurred." "I need to see the tactical recordings," Lyra demanded, her voice steady despite the patterns of grief now flowing across her skin. "I need to understand what really happened." "Of course, Doctor, I'll transmit the relevant data to your secure terminal. Mrs., please accept our condolences for the loss of your people." The transmission ended, leaving the dining room in heavy silence. Ambassador was the first to speak, his melodious voice carrying undertones of deep concern. "This is most troubling. Such incidents have a way of escalating beyond rational control. Guided Lyra to a chair, his hands gentle but his mind clearly racing. We'll review the data together. There has to be an explanation that makes sense. Over the next several hours, they pored over the tactical recordings and sensor data from the human defense station. The footage showed the research vessel approaching the military installation at high speed, ignoring repeated hail attempts and defensive warnings. When the ship came within weapons range of the station, it suddenly accelerated directly toward the main docking bay. The human response had been swift and devastating. Defense turrets opened fire, but the ship's momentum carried it forward even as it was being torn apart. The final explosion occurred just meters from the station's hull, close enough to damage several external sensors but not breach the main structure. "It doesn't make sense," Lyra said for the dozenth time, her skin patterns cycling between confusion and grief. "The serenity of thought was commanded by Captain. I knew him personally. He was one of our most experienced navigators and a dedicated pacifist. He would never attempt something like this." Studied the sensor readings, his scientific training allowing him to parse the technical data more effectively than most diplomats. "The ship's trajectory is wrong," he said finally. "Look at this approach vector. If they were really trying to ram the station, they would have come in on a more direct path. This looks more like they were trying to dock," Lyra finished, understanding dawning in her voice. "They thought they had permission to approach. But they ignored multiple hails," pointed out. "Why wouldn't they respond to communication attempts?" Lyra's patterns shifted to display bitter realization. Because they couldn't hear them. What if their communication array was damaged? What if they were trying to dock for emergency repairs and simply couldn't receive the human warnings? The possibility hung between them like a toxic cloud. If Lyra was right, then the destruction of the serenity of thought wasn't an act of aggression but a tragic accident caused by miscommunication and fear. 23 scientists and researchers had died because neither side had the patience to verify what was really happening. The political fallout was immediate and severe. Within hours of the incident, news networks were broadcasting footage of the ship's destruction alongside emotional testimonials from the families of the deceased. Human media responded with their own coverage, focusing on the threat to the military installation and praising the quick response of the defense forces. Both governments struggled to control the narrative, but the damage was already spreading. Protests erupted on Worlds, with citizens demanding justice for what they saw as an unprovoked attack. Human colonies along the border began reporting increased military patrols and civilian panic about potential retaliation. Lyra threw herself into damage control, using her unique position as both a citizen and a human spouse to appeal for calm on both sides. She gave interviews to media outlets across human space, explaining culture and the peaceful nature of her people. She emphasized that the research vessel's approach had almost certainly been a mistake, not an attack. Supported her efforts, using his own scientific credentials to analyze and explain the technical aspects of what had happened. Together, they presented a united front that seemed to resonate with moderate voices in both societies. For a few weeks, it appeared that their efforts might be successful in preventing the incident from escalating into larger conflict. Then the second incident occurred. This time it was a human cargo hauler that strayed into space near the colonies. The ship, the Prosperity, was carrying agricultural supplies to a human settlement when it experienced what the crew later described as a navigation system malfunction. Instead of dropping out of hyperspace at their intended destination, they emerged deep within territory. The response was swift but measured. A patrol vessel intercepted the cargo hauler and attempted to establish communication. However, the human crew, already on edge from reports about the destruction of the serenity of thought, interpreted the approach as hostile. When the alien ship began moving closer to scan their cargo holds, the humans opened fire. The engagement was brief but devastating. The human ship's weapons were designed for anti-piracy operations and were more powerful than anything the Peaceful had expected to encounter. The patrol vessel was destroyed almost instantly, taking with it 15 young officers who had been conducting their first deep space assignment. The Prosperity escaped back to human space, where her crew reported that they had been attacked without provocation by forces. Their story, combined with the earlier incident involving the serenity of thought, created a narrative of escalating aggression that proved impossible to contain. Lyra watched the news coverage with growing despair, her skin patterns displaying the deep black of profound grief. Two incidents, both caused by misunderstanding and fear, had shattered months of careful diplomatic progress. The marriage alliance that was supposed to prevent war now seemed powerless against the momentum of mutual suspicion and retaliation. "We have to do something," she told as they sat in their quarters aboard Harmony Station. "Both sides are preparing for conflict. The Council has authorized the construction of defensive platforms, and your government is mobilizing additional fleet assets." Nodded grimly, his face showing the strain of the past few weeks. "I've been in contact with my colleagues in the Colonial Council. Some of them are still willing to listen to reason, but the Hawks are gaining influence. Admiral Harrison has been pushing for preemptive strikes against military installations." "Preemptive strikes?" Lyra's patterns flared with alarm. "But we have no military installations. Our defensive platforms are exactly that, defensive. They're designed to protect our colonies from asteroid impacts and solar flares, not to attack other species." "I know that and you know that, but fear has a way of distorting perception," replied. "The military advisors are convinced that they are building up for a major assault. They're interpreting every defensive measure as evidence of aggressive intent." Lyra stood and began packing, her movements sharp with frustration. "This is exactly what we were trying to prevent. How did it all go wrong so quickly?" Watched her with growing concern. In the months since their marriage, he had learned to read emotional displays almost as well as a native. What he saw now worried him deeply. Lyra's patterns were beginning to display the chaotic swirls that indicated extreme psychological stress, the kind that could lead to complete emotional breakdown in her species. "Lyra, you need to rest," he said gently. "You've been pushing yourself too hard trying to fix this situation." "I can't rest," she replied, her voice carrying harmonic undertones of desperation. "Don't you understand? This marriage was supposed to be the solution. If it fails, if we can't prevent this war, then everything my people sacrificed will have been for nothing. The Council trusted me to make this work." Stood and moved to intercept her packing, placing his hands on her shoulders. The touch seemed to calm her slightly, her patterns shifting from chaotic swirls to more ordered spirals of anxiety. "You're not responsible for the actions of entire civilizations," he said firmly. "We tried our best to create a bridge between our peoples. The fact that others chose fear over understanding isn't our failure." But even as he spoke the words, felt a cold certainty settling in his stomach. The momentum toward conflict was becoming unstoppable, driven by forces beyond their ability to influence. Soon, both sides would be forced to choose between capitulation and war. And he was beginning to suspect that, when that moment came, the choice wouldn't be as difficult as either of them hoped. The attack on Nu changed everything. Lyra received the emergency transmission while she was in the middle of a delicate negotiation with human colonial representatives. The holographic display materialized without warning, showing the tear-streaked face of her cousin Myra, whose skin patterns were cycling through combinations of grief and rage that Lyra had never seen before. "Lyra, you have to come home," Myra said, her voice breaking with emotion. "They destroyed the learning centers, the children. Oh, blessed ancestors, the children." The transmission cut to footage from the planet's surface, and Lyra felt her world collapse. Where the graceful spires of Nu's primary education complex had stood for over 2 centuries, now only twisted metal and crystal fragments remained. Emergency response teams moved through the debris, their skin patterns dulled with shock as they searched for survivors. "How many?" Lyra whispered, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. 317 confirmed dead," Myra replied. "Most of them were younglings in their first learning phase. The human strike ships came out of nowhere. They said it was a military target, but Lyra, it was a school, just a school." The human delegation had gone silent, their faces pale with shock. Ambassador Torres, who had been leading the peace talks, cleared his throat nervously. "Mrs., please accept our deepest condolences. I'm certain this was some kind of terrible mistake." Lyra turned to look at him, and the human diplomat took an involuntary step backward. Her skin patterns had shifted to something he had never seen before, geometric designs in stark white and silver that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. "A mistake," she said, her voice carrying harmonic undertones that made the humans in the room feel physically uncomfortable. Your military destroyed a school and you call it a mistake. Entered the conference room at that moment, having been summoned by the emergency alert. He took one look at his wife's skin patterns and immediately understood that something catastrophic had occurred. Lyra, what's happened? She turned to him, and for a moment her patterns shifted to display the kind of anguish that transcended species boundaries. They killed the children. Your people killed our children. The recording played again, showing the devastation of the learning centers, watched in growing horror as the scope of the destruction became clear. This wasn't the result of an accidental weapons discharge or a targeting error. The precision of the attack, the complete destruction of the educational facilities while leaving nearby residential areas largely intact, suggested deliberate intent. "This has to be investigated," said, his voice tight with shock. "No one authorized attacks on civilian targets. This goes against every rule of engagement in human military doctrine." Ambassador Torres was already on his communication device, speaking in rapid, urgent tones to someone on the other end. When he finished the call, his expression was grim. "I've just spoken with Colonial Command. They're claiming this was a preemptive strike against a military research facility. Intelligence reports suggested they were developing biological weapons at this location." Biological weapons? Lyra's patterns shifted to display incredulous fury. It was a school for children. The only research conducted there involved teaching younglings about plant cultivation and ecological harmony. "I'm just reporting what I've been told," Torres said defensively. "Our military intelligence indicated." "Your military intelligence was wrong," Lyra interrupted, her voice rising to harmonic frequencies that made the humans wince. "And 300 children died because of that mistake." Moved to stand beside his wife, but she stepped away from him, her patterns now displaying a complex mixture of grief and something that looked disturbingly like rejection. For the first time since their marriage, she was looking at him not as her partner, but as a representative of the species that had just massacred her people's children. "Lyra, please," he said softly. "Let me help you get through this. We'll find out what really happened and make sure those responsible are held accountable." "Will we?" she asked, her patterns shifting to display bitter skepticism. "Will your people really hold their own military accountable for killing alien children? Or will they find a way to justify it as a necessary action in the name of human security?" The question hung in the air like a toxin. Wanted to assure her that justice would be served, but he couldn't ignore the growing anti-alien sentiment in human space. The media coverage of recent incidents had been increasingly skewed toward portraying thee as a threat, and public opinion was shifting toward supporting more aggressive military action. Over the following days, the truth about the attack became even more disturbing. Leaked intelligence reports revealed that the targeting data for the strike had been provided by a human extremist group called the Terra First Coalition. They had deliberately the learning centers as military facilities, knowing that human forces would strike without conducting their own verification. The coalition's leader, a charismatic former military officer named Colonel James, appeared on news networks across human space to defend the action. "The may look peaceful," he declared during one interview, "but their bioadaptation technology could be weaponized in ways that would make them nearly unstoppable. We couldn't afford to wait until they developed the capability to reshape our own biological systems against us." His words resonated with frightened human populations who had been fed a steady diet of anti-alien propaganda since the first incidents began. Support for the attack grew rather than diminished, with polls showing that 60% of humans approved of the preemptive strike despite the civilian casualties. Lyra watched these developments with growing despair and rage. She had dedicated her life to building bridges between species, believing that understanding could overcome fear and suspicion. Now, she was forced to confront the possibility that some humans were simply incapable of seeing other species as anything but threats to be eliminated. The breaking point came during a memorial service for the victims of Nu. Lyra had returned to her to participate in the traditional ceremonies, leaving behind on Harmony Station to coordinate with human authorities who claimed to be investigating the attack. The service was broadcast across space, allowing billions of citizens to participate in the collective mourning. As Lyra stood among the families of the victims, listening to the harmonic lamentations that rose from the assembled crowd, she felt something fundamental shift within her psyche. The patterns flowing across her skin began to display colors that No had seen for over 1,000 years. The deep crimson and black spirals that their ancestors had once used to mark warriors preparing for total war. The crowd fell silent as they recognized the ancient patterns. Lyra had become something that their peaceful civilization had thought extinct, driven by righteous fury to the point where violence became not only acceptable but necessary. "They think we are weak," she said, her voice carrying across the memorial ground through natural acoustic properties that architects had built into their ceremonial spaces. "They believe our commitment to peace makes us helpless. They murder our children and expect us to respond with nothing but diplomatic protests." The patterns on her skin grew more intense, spreading to display imagery that told the story of ancient history. The wars that had nearly destroyed their species before they chose the path of harmony. The terrible weapons they had developed and then voluntarily abandoned. The power they had deliberately renounced in the name of peaceful coexistence. "Perhaps it is time," she continued, "for them to learn that we chose peace not because we were incapable of war, but because we knew too well what we were capable of." The response was immediate and electric. Across space, citizens who had never considered the possibility of aggressive action began to display their own warrior patterns. Ancient genetic memories awakened, bringing with them knowledge that had been suppressed for. The peaceful gardeners of the galaxy remembered that their ancestors had once been capable of reshaping matter at the molecular level, turning entire star systems into weapons of unimaginable destruction. Watch the broadcast from Harmony Station, his heart breaking as he saw his wife transform into something alien and terrible. When she mentioned that the human marriage alliance had been revealed as a futile gesture, her patterns displayed the kind of cold determination that he had only read about in historical accounts of humanity's own darkest periods. He tried to contact her immediately after the ceremony, but his calls went unanswered. When he finally managed to reach one of her diplomatic aides, the message was brief and devastating. "Ambassador Lyra no longer recognizes her marriage to the human doctor. She has renounced all ties to human civilization and returned to serve the Defense Council in their planning for the coming conflict." The Defense Council itself was a body that hadn't convened in over 800 years, consisting of ancient whose memories reached back to the time before their species chose pacifism. Their emergence from deep meditation chambers sent shockwaves throughout the galaxy, as even other alien civilizations recognized the significance of their awakening. Within weeks, reports began filtering in of strange phenomena in space. Stars were changing color as their output was being manipulated at the quantum level. Planets were being evacuated and converted into massive biological processing facilities. Most disturbing of all, ships began appearing at the edges of human space, not the graceful research vessels and diplomatic craft that humans had grown accustomed to, but angular constructs that seemed to bend space around them in ways that violated several known laws of physics. Human military commanders scrambled to respond to this new threat, but they quickly discovered that conventional weapons were useless against technology that could manipulate matter at the subatomic level. Ships simply absorbed energy weapons and converted the matter of kinetic projectiles into more raw materials for their own construction. Found himself in an impossible position. As one of the few humans who truly understood capabilities, he was consulted by military leaders who wanted to know how to fight an enemy that seemed to operate outside the normal rules of physics. But every piece of information he provided felt like a betrayal of the woman he had married and the people he had come to respect. The first human colonies to fall were the frontier settlements that had been most vocal in their support for aggressive action against aliens. The response was precise and terrifying, not random destruction, but carefully calculated elimination of those who had actively promoted violence against peaceful species. Entire cities were converted to their component molecules and reformed into memorial gardens dedicated to the children who had died on Nu. As news of the attacks spread, panic began to grip human space. The same populations that had cheered the destruction of the learning centers now faced the prospect of retaliation from an enemy whose capabilities they had never truly understood. The Terra First Coalition's rhetoric about weakness was revealed as catastrophically wrong. Made one final attempt to reach Lyra, broadcasting a message on all communication frequencies. He appeared before the camera with tears in his eyes, speaking directly to the woman who had once been his wife. "Lyra, I know you can hear this. I know what my species has done is unforgivable, but please remember that not all humans supported those actions. There are millions of us who want peace, who respect your people and mourn the loss of your children. Don't let the actions of extremists destroy everything we tried to build together. The response came 3 days later, broadcast across all human communication networks simultaneously. Lyra appeared on screen, her skin now permanently displaying the warrior patterns that marked her as one of the war leaders. She was beautiful and terrible, and when she spoke, her words carried the harmonic undertones of absolute authority. "Doctor," she said, using his formal title rather than his given name, "you speak of the humans who want peace as if their existence absolves your species of guilt. But where were these peaceful humans when children were being murdered? Where were they when extremists took control of your military? They stood by in silence and allowed the violence to continue because it was not directed at them." Her patterns shifted to display complex geometric forms that seemed to writhe with their own inner light. "You believe that your species can commit atrocities and then escape consequences by claiming that not everyone participated. This is the same logic that allowed your people to destroy countless civilizations throughout your expansion into space. The time for such selective accountability has ended." Felt his blood turn to ice as the implications of her words became clear. "Lyra, what are you saying?" Her response was delivered with the kind of calm certainty that made it all the more terrifying. "We are saying that humanity's expansion through the galaxy ends now. Your species will be contained to your current systems until you learn to coexist peacefully with other forms of life. Those who resist this containment will be removed. Those who accept it will be allowed to continue their existence under careful supervision." "And if we refuse to accept containment?" For the first time in the transmission, something resembling emotion flickered across Lyra's patterns. It might have been sadness, or it might have been pity. "Then you will discover why our ancestors chose peace over power, and why that choice was made in the aftermath of the greatest act of destruction the galaxy has ever witnessed." The transmission ended, leaving staring at a blank screen and contemplating the magnitude of what his species had unleashed. The woman he had married in hopes of preventing a war had become the architect of humanity's potential annihilation. And somewhere in the depths of his scientist's mind, he was beginning to understand that she might be right to do so. The siege of Earth began not with explosions or invasion fleets, but with silence. Human communication networks across the solar system simply stopped functioning. Ships in transit found their navigation systems failing as the quantum entanglement networks that connected human space collapsed simultaneously. Even basic electromagnetic communications became unreliable as mysterious interference patterns disrupted radio waves and subspace transmissions. Watched the systematic isolation of humanity unfold from his position aboard Harmony Station, which had become an island of neutrality in an increasingly hostile galaxy. The and other species had evacuated their personnel, leaving only a skeleton crew of human scientists and diplomats who found themselves cut off from home as effectively as if they had been transported to another dimension. "The quantum infrastructure is being dismantled at the molecular level," reported Dr. Sarah, the station's chief physicist, during an emergency briefing. "Whatever they are doing, it's not just blocking our communications. They're actually unraveling the physical structures that make faster-than-light communication possible." Studied the technical readouts with growing dread. They weren't simply jamming human technology, they were rewriting the fundamental laws of physics in the regions around human space. Areas that had once allowed instantaneous communication across vast distances were becoming dead zones where information could travel no faster than the speed of light. "How is this possible?" asked Ambassador Torres, his face pale with exhaustion and stress. "Our best scientists said that kind of manipulation was theoretically impossible." "Our best scientists were wrong," replied quietly. "They have had thousands of years to study quantum mechanics at levels we've never imagined. What looks like magic to us is just highly advanced science that we're not capable of understanding yet." The implications were staggering. Without faster-than-light communication, the human colonial empire would fragment into isolated systems unable to coordinate defense or provide mutual support. Each world would be forced to stand alone against whatever they chose to do next. The next phase of the siege revealed the true scope of capabilities. Reports filtered in from the few human ships still able to maintain contact that stars throughout human space were beginning to change. Not dramatic explosions or novas, but subtle alterations in their output that suggested someone was fine-tuning stellar fusion at the nuclear level. The star closest to the agricultural world of New Kansas began producing radiation that was toxic to human crops but harmless to native plant life. Within weeks, the colonial population was facing famine as their food production systems collapsed. Similar modifications were occurring throughout human space, with each star being adjusted to create specific environmental pressures that made human habitation increasingly difficult while leaving the fundamental stellar processes intact. They're terraforming in reverse, realized as he studied the reports. Instead of adapting worlds to suit human biology, they're adapting the stellar environment to make human biology unsustainable. The psychological impact on human populations was almost as devastating as the physical effects. Riots broke out on several worlds as citizens demanded that their governments negotiate surrender before the situation worsened. Other colonies saw the rise of extremist groups that called for desperate military strikes against targets, despite the obvious futility of such actions. Colonel and his Terra First Coalition attempted to rally human resistance by broadcasting speeches about human superiority and the need to fight extinction. But their rhetoric rang hollow when faced with an enemy that could manipulate stars like garden tools and reshape reality at the quantum level. Found himself in the strange position of being one of the few humans who understood what was really happening. His years of studying culture and his marriage to Lyra had given him insights that most humans lacked. He knew that they weren't acting out of simple revenge or territorial aggression. They were implementing what they saw as a necessary quarantine to prevent humanity from spreading its violence throughout the galaxy. The confirmation of his analysis came when Lyra contacted him directly for the first time since her transformation into a war leader. The transmission arrived on a secure channel that shouldn't have been accessible from space, suggesting that their technology had advanced even further than he had imagined. She appeared on his screen looking much as she had during their final conversation, her skin still displaying the warrior patterns that marked her new role, but could see subtle changes in her posture and expression that suggested the psychological toll of her new responsibilities. She said, using his given name for the first time in months, "I wanted you to understand what is happening to your species before the final phase begins." Final phase? Felt his stomach clench with dread. Lyra, what more could you possibly do to us? Her patterns shifted to display what he recognized as regret mixed with determination. We are not destroying humanity. We are preserving it in a form that will no longer threaten other species. Your people will be allowed to continue existing, but only within carefully controlled parameters. She gestured, and the transmission expanded to show a three-dimensional map of human space. Red zones marked areas where stellar manipulation was already, while blue zones indicated regions that remained unchanged. Noticed immediately that the blue zones were all systems with smaller populations and less developed industrial infrastructure. The agricultural worlds and research colonies will be left alone, Lyra explained. Humans who choose peaceful coexistence and sustainable development will be allowed to thrive. But the military-industrial complexes, the weapons manufacturing centers, the bases used to launch aggressive expansion, these will be neutralized permanently. You're dismantling human civilization, said, his voice barely above a whisper. We are dismantling the parts of human civilization that pose a threat to galactic peace, she corrected. Your species will survive, but it will no longer have the capability to wage interstellar war or forcibly colonize systems inhabited by other forms of life. Stared at the map, seeing the systematic deconstruction of everything humanity had built over centuries of expansion. And if we refuse to accept this, if we find a way to fight back? Lyra's patterns shifted to display something that might have been sadness. Then you will force us to implement more permanent solutions. The ancient weapons of my people were designed to eliminate entire species while leaving their worlds intact for other forms of life. We would prefer not to use such measures, but we will if necessary. The threat was delivered without emotion or dramatic flourish, which somehow made it more terrifying than any passionate declaration of war. Found himself facing the woman he had married, who now spoke casually about the potential extinction of his entire species, as if it were a regrettable but necessary administrative decision. There has to be another way, he said desperately. Not all humans are like the extremists who attacked your children. We can change, we can learn to be better. Can you? Lyra asked, her patterns now displaying genuine curiosity rather than rhetorical challenge. Your species has encountered dozens of other civilizations during your expansion, and in every case, the result has been the same. You arrive, you claim territory, you displace or destroy any inhabitants who resist your presence. This pattern has been consistent for over 200 years of human space exploration. Wanted to argue, but the historical record was undeniable. Humanity's expansion had indeed involved the displacement or extinction of numerous alien species, most of whom had been too primitive to offer effective resistance. The few that had fought back had been labeled as hostile and subjected to military action that usually resulted in their elimination. But we're capable of change, he insisted. The marriage alliance between us proves that humans can form peaceful relationships with other species. Does it? Lyra's patterns shifted to display bitter irony. Our marriage was a political arrangement designed to prevent conflict. It lasted exactly as long as it took for your people to find an excuse to resume their aggressive behavior. The moment they believed we posed a threat, they murdered our children without hesitation. How does that demonstrate your capacity for change? The accusation hit like a physical blow because he couldn't deny its essential truth. Despite all their efforts, despite the personal bond they had developed, the marriage alliance had crumbled the instant human fears and prejudices were activated. The moderate voices had been overwhelmed by extremist rhetoric, and the result had been exactly the kind of tragedy they had tried to prevent. What about the humans who opposed the violence? Asked, grasping for some argument that might reach whatever remained of the woman he had married. What about the millions who protested against the attack on your children? They opposed it after it happened, Lyra replied. But where were they when the extremists were gaining power? Where were they when the military was being convinced to launch preemptive strikes? Your peaceful humans are only peaceful when the violence doesn't affect them directly. When faced with difficult choices, they consistently choose comfort over justice. Felt the weight of her words settling into his bones like lead. She wasn't wrong. The moderate human population had indeed stood by while extremists shaped policy, only protesting when the consequences became undeniable. Their passivity had been as instrumental in creating the current crisis as the active malice of the Terra First Coalition. So this is it? He asked. You've decided to end human expansion permanently. We have decided to prevent humanity from spreading its particular form of civilization beyond its current borders, Lyra corrected. Within those borders, your species can develop whatever social structures you choose. You can build, create, explore, and grow. You simply cannot do so at the expense of other civilizations. The transmission began to fade but called out desperately. Lyra, wait, what about us? What about what we built together? Her image stabilized for a moment, and for the first time in the conversation, her patterns displayed something that looked like genuine emotion. What we built was beautiful, but it was built on a foundation of lies. I believed that individual relationships could overcome species-wide patterns of behavior. You believed that your people would choose peace over dominance when given the opportunity. We were both wrong. It doesn't have to end this way, pleaded. We could try again, we could build something better. No, Lyra said softly, her patterns now displaying the deep purple of final resolution. Some bridges once burned cannot be rebuilt. Some trust once broken cannot be restored. What your species did to our children revealed the truth that we had both been trying to ignore. Humans and are fundamentally incompatible. One of us values individual growth above collective harmony, while the other values collective harmony above individual ambition. Those worldviews cannot coexist in the same galaxy without eventually coming into conflict. The transmission ended, leaving alone with the reality of what humanity had brought upon itself. In trying to prevent a war, he had married a woman who had now become the architect of his species' containment. In seeking to prove that humans were capable of peaceful coexistence, he had instead provided them with intimate knowledge of human nature that they were now using to design the perfect prison. Outside the station's viewports, the stars continued their slow transformation, being reshaped by technologies that humanity could barely comprehend. Soon, human space would become a closed system, isolated from the rest of the galaxy by barriers that could not be crossed or overcome. The age of human expansion was ending not with a bang, but with the methodical precision of a superior civilization that had finally decided to treat humanity the way humans had always treated other species, as a problem to be solved rather than partners to be respected. And who had once dreamed of building bridges between civilizations, could only watch as the woman he had loved completed the construction of walls that would last forever. 50 years after the containment, as historians would later call it, stood in the observation deck of New Geneva Station, watching ships from a dozen human worlds conduct what had become known as the Great Reunion. After 5 decades of forced isolation, the scattered colonies of human space were finally able to communicate and trade freely again, within the boundaries that they had established. The barriers that surrounded human space were invisible but absolute. Ships attempting to cross the perimeter simply found themselves back where they started, as if space itself had folded to prevent their passage. Scientists had spent decades trying to understand the mechanism, but it remained as mysterious as the day it was implemented. Himself was now in his 90s, his hair silver and his face lined with the weight of years, spent contemplating the choices that had led to humanity's current situation. As one of the few humans who had actually known the before the containment, he had become something of a living historical artifact, consulted by researchers trying to understand how the galaxy's greatest power had come to view humanity as a threat requiring permanent isolation. "Doctor," a young voice interrupted his contemplation. He turned to see Doctor, a historian from the University of Mars who had been interviewing him for her research on pre-containment human-alien relations. "Please call me," he said, as he had dozens of times before. "What can I do for you today?" "I've been studying the final communications between you and your wife," she said, holding up a data pad containing the transcripts that had become required reading for students of galactic history. "I'm trying to understand something. At the end, she said that some bridges once burned could not be rebuilt, but looking at what humanity has accomplished in the past 50 years, I wonder if she was wrong." Followed her gesture toward the viewport, where representatives from the peaceful agricultural worlds were meeting with delegates from the reformed industrial colonies. In the decades since the military-industrial complexes had been dismantled, human civilization had indeed evolved in ways that might have surprised both him and Lyra. Without the capability for interstellar warfare, humans had been forced to focus their competitive instincts inward, on problems that could be solved through cooperation rather than conquest. The result had been an unprecedented period of technological and social development. They had solved climate change, developed sustainable energy systems, and created social structures that prioritized long-term thinking over short-term profit. "Perhaps she was," admitted, "but the cost of that transformation was enormous. We lost our freedom to explore beyond these boundaries. We lost contact with the wider galactic community, and we lost the opportunity to learn from other species through voluntary interaction." Nodded thoughtfully. "But we also stopped displacing other civilizations. We stopped treating the galaxy as territory to be conquered. Isn't it possible that they were right to contain us until we learned those lessons?" It was a question that had wrestled with for 5 decades, and he still wasn't sure he had an answer. The problem with forced learning is that it doesn't necessarily change the underlying nature of the species being taught. We've become more peaceful within our boundaries, but is that because we've genuinely evolved, or just because we don't have any choice? "Does it matter?" asked. "If the result is the same, a human civilization that no longer threatens other species, then perhaps they achieved their goal." Before could respond, an alarm began sounding throughout the station. It was a soft, musical tone that he hadn't heard in 50 years, but that he recognized immediately. It was the contact signal that had once been used to announce communications from ships. The station's command center erupted into controlled chaos as technicians scrambled to verify that their systems weren't malfunctioning. After half a century of complete silence from the sudden resumption of contact sent shockwaves through human space. Made his way to the communications center, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. If they were reaching out after all these years, it could mean anything from the lifting of the containment to the implementation of even more restrictive measures. The main display activated, and found himself looking at a figure he almost didn't recognize. The on-screen was clearly ancient even by their long-lived standards, their skin displaying complex patterns that spoke of centuries of accumulated wisdom and authority. When they spoke, Their voice carried harmonic undertones that suggested they were one of the original members of the Defense Council. Humans of the contained space, the figure said, their patterns shifting to display formal diplomatic protocols that remembered from his early studies of culture. I am Elder Ra of the Eternal Council. We have monitored your development over the past 50 of your years, and we believe it is time for a conversation. The communication was being broadcast throughout human space, reaching every colony and station simultaneously. Realized that he was witnessing a moment that would reshape human history as dramatically as the original containment. Your species has significant changes since the implementation of the protective barriers, Elder Ra continued. You have developed technologies focused on sustainability rather than expansion. You have created social structures that prioritize collective welfare over individual accumulation. Most importantly, you have maintained these changes consistently for 5 decades, suggesting that they represent genuine evolution rather than temporary adaptation. Felt his breath catch in his throat. After 50 years of isolation, they were acknowledging that humanity had changed. But what did that recognition mean for the future? However, the elder continued, we must also acknowledge that these changes occurred only under conditions of forced constraint. The question that now faces both our species is whether humans can maintain their evolved behaviors when given freedom of choice. The elder's patterns shifted to display what recognized as cautious optimism. We propose a test. A single human ship will be permitted to travel beyond the containment barriers, carrying representatives of your various worlds and colonies. This ship will visit other civilizations in the galaxy and demonstrate whether humanity has truly learned to interact peacefully with other forms of life. The implications were staggering. After 50 years of isolation, humanity was being offered a chance to rejoin the galactic community, but only if they could prove that they had genuinely changed rather than simply been forcibly restrained. If your representatives demonstrate the ability to interact respectfully with other species, Elder Ra explained, then the barriers will be gradually reduced, allowing humanity to resume its place in galactic civilization. If, however, they revert to the patterns of behavior that necessitated the containment, then the barriers will be made permanent and irreversible. The transmission paused and realized that the elder was looking directly at him, despite the fact that the broadcast was reaching millions of humans simultaneously. Doctor, the elder said, you who were married to the architect of the containment, who witnessed both the hope and the failure of the original alliance between our species, you will lead this mission. Your unique perspective makes you the ideal candidate to represent humanity in this crucial test. Felt the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders like a mantle made of lead. At 93, he was being asked to undertake the most important diplomatic mission in human history, a mission that would determine whether his species remained prisoners in their own corner of the galaxy or earned the right to once again explore the stars. Over the following months, the selection process for the test mission became the most closely watched event in human space. Representatives were chosen from every major colony and cultural group, creating a crew that reflected the diversity of human civilization while embodying its evolution toward peaceful coexistence. The ship itself was a marvel of post-containment human engineering, designed according to principles of sustainability and non-aggression that would have been alien to pre-containment humanity. Its weapons were purely defensive, its resource systems were completely self-contained, and its design incorporated artistic elements that spoke to humanity's newfound appreciation for beauty over pure functionality. As prepared for departure, he found himself thinking often of Lyra and the choices that had led to this moment. In their final conversation, she had spoken of bridges that could not be rebuilt and trust that could not be restored. But perhaps she had been thinking in terms that were too immediate, too focused on their own generation rather than the potential for genuine long-term change. The day of departure arrived with ceremonial fanfare that was broadcast throughout human space. Representatives from every world gathered to wish the mission success, understanding that the fate of their species' future hung in the balance. As the ship prepared to cross the containment barrier for the first time in 50 years, stood on the bridge looking out at the stars that had been forbidden to his people for so long. He thought of the young who had married an alien diplomat in hopes of preventing a war, and wondered if that idealistic scientist would recognize the elderly man who was now tasked with proving that humanity deserved a second chance. The barrier parted before them like a curtain of invisible energy, and suddenly the ship was in open space, surrounded by stars that no human had seen in half a century. Long-range sensors immediately began picking up signals from alien civilizations, evidence of the vibrant galactic community that humanity had been excluded from. Their first destination was a research station, chosen because they had always been neutral mediators in galactic affairs. If humanity could demonstrate peaceful intentions to them, it would be a strong first step toward rejoining the broader community. As the ship approached the station, received a private communication on a frequency he hadn't heard in decades. The transmission contained only a few words, but they were in Lyra's voice, speaking in the harmonic tones of the language. The bridge you thought was destroyed was merely dormant, waiting for someone worthy to cross it again. Prove that humanity has learned wisdom, and perhaps we can build something better than what we lost. Smiled, understanding finally that the test wasn't just about humanity earning the right to rejoin the galaxy. It was about proving that the hope that had once brought a human scientist and a diplomat together in marriage was not naive idealism, but a genuine possibility that had simply come before its time. The future remained unwritten, but for the first time in 50 years, it held the promise of hope rather than the certainty of containment. Whether that promise would be fulfilled depended on humanity's ability to prove that they had truly learned the lessons that their isolation was meant to teach. As the ship docked with the station and prepared to meet with aliens for the first time in half a century, he carried with him not just the hopes of his species, but the possibility that love and understanding could ultimately triumph over fear and prejudice. The greatest test in human history was about to begin.